Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Today's conversation features bassist, singer, and songwriter Alan Hampton. Alan grew up in Houston, Texas. His mother was a piano teacher, and he attended the prestigious HSPVA Performing Arts High School before moving to New York to go to the New School. After a brief stint in L.A. at the Thelonious Monk Institute, he moved back to New York to pursue a career in music. Alan is often recognized for his work as a sideman, playing bass with his old friend from high school, Robert Glasper, as well as with the singers Gretchen Parlato, Becca Stevens, and the singer-songwriter Andrew Bird. And lately, he's also been working with the great bass player, singer-songwriter Michelle Indigio-Cello, which is a really interesting pairing and sounds like a very unique project. He's also released 2 CDs of his own material as a singer-songwriter. His most recent album, Origami for the Fire, came out in the fall of 2014. And I have to say, I'm such a fan of his songwriting and singing. It really reaches into this sweet spot. It's so musical, and yet it's so emotional and romantic, and something very powerful about his music for me. Something that impresses me and stands out about Alan is his ability to really live in multiple musical worlds and maintain his own sense of identity in all of them. It's not so much that he convincingly plays in different styles. It's that he has his own style, which he applies in all genres. In our conversation here, he talks about making what he calls genreless music, and I think I know what he means. I've known Alan for a while, and we've worked together on a number of projects. Sometimes the interviews with your friends can be the most challenging because you think you know the answers. But, perhaps not surprisingly, I managed to learn a lot here. If you haven't subscribed to The Third Story already, you can go to third-story.com and sign up directly to the mailing list, or you can click the link to take you to the iTunes Music Store where you can subscribe. And if you like what you hear, please leave a review. You can also like the podcast on Facebook. It's Third Story with Leo Sidran. And I tweet at Leo Sidran. Before we get started with the conversation, I want to play a song from Alan's most recent album. Here's Keep It in Your Dreams.
Keep it in your dreams, I don't ever want to see. All the things you do and all the other ways you love to be. Oh, it's a matter of the heart, and it's a life or death matter, or fall apart. It's just a vision in the dark. It doesn't make them out clear, and you won't see a reflection in the shadow of a mirror. And you won't see me, so I don't ever have to know about your fantasy. So keep it in your dreams, strange as I know it may seem. I don't need to know about the places that you roam alone. Oh, it's a matter of the heart. Oh, it's a life or death matter, or fall apart. It's just a vision in the dark. It doesn't make them out clear, and you won't see a reflection in the shadow of a mirror. And you won't see me, so I don't ever have to know about your fantasy. Oh, you won't see me, so I don't ever have to know about your fantasy. So keep it in your dream. Keep it in your dream. Keep it in your dream. matter of the heart. Oh, it's a life or death matter. I'll fall apart. It's just a vision in the dark. It doesn't make a matter clear, and you won't see a reflection in the shadow of a mirror. And you won't see me, so I don't ever have to know about your fantasy. No, you won't see me, so I don't ever have to know about your fantasy. So keep it in your dreams. Keep it in your dreams. Keep it in your dreams. Keep it in your dreams.
Alan Hampton, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Leo Sidran.
You know, we are friends. I've known you for a while, but I was thinking about it before you came over today. I'm a fan. I'm a straight-up fan of your records, man.
Well, thank you. Likewise.
I put on your record today, and my stomach tightened in that way that when you hear something that you just really love, you physically respond. And it made me realize how unassuming you are about that. I mean, I know you're out here hustling, trying to, like, get it listened to and have people pay attention to. But it occurs to me how non-assuming you are about it, because you have this varied life. You know, you have this career. Some people know you as a bass player. Some people know you as a songwriter. Some people know you as a lot of different things. How do you think of yourself right now?
It's kind of a hard question to answer, but I think that I'm just trying to be an artist that just kind of has stuff to say, that has commentary on different musical contexts. And that, you know, whether I'm being a sideman or whether I'm playing the bass or the guitar, regardless of what my level of proficiency is on each instrument, I just kind of want to feel like I have enough of a musical personality to where I can contribute something. So I don't know if that's what I am right now, but I think that's what my goal state is, you know, and that statement can be strong enough to sort of, you know, I guess be worth paying attention to.
It seems to me that at some point you were very focused on being a more than proficient bass player.
Yeah.
Was that your first instrument?
Well, my first instrument was guitar. I picked that up when I was 10. And then I switched to drums. Of course, my parents didn't want me to get a drum set, so they got me a set of bongos. So I played bongos for a little while. Eventually graduated to drums. And then there was a demand for bass players in the high school HSPVA in Houston, Texas, where I'm from, and they needed a bass player. And so I kind of worked really hard to learn how to play bass so I could go to this school and study with the director.
So you were aware of the school, and you became a bass player in order to be able to go to the school.
Yeah. They had a jazz program and have a jazz program that was really well known in Houston. I was really interested in jazz, you know. I was playing drum set at Lamar High School, the public school where I was zoned in Houston. And it was just kind of, that class was like the class you took if you didn't want to have to show up, you know. But I got really interested in the music, and I knew HSPVA had a great program, so I just wanted to go for it and get serious.
What did your parents do?
My dad's a lawyer. My mom is a piano teacher. So we're divorced when I was 2 or something, but I grew up mostly in my mom's house where the piano was.
So you had some understanding of music and music as a profession even when you were a kid?
Yeah, I guess I did. I mean, my mom was a piano teacher. She wasn't out playing a lot of concerts and stuff, but she made her living dealing with music, you know.
Yeah. So when you decided that you wanted to go to this performing arts high school, did it seem like a strange thing in your family, or was it kind of like made sense from the kind of kid that you were?
I think that my parents knew how interested I was in music, so maybe they weren't surprised, and they were probably really glad to see me apply myself to something. I was a terrible student before. I mean, I was always in summer school. I was failing classes all the time. I didn't care at all. I was a class skipper and all that stuff. So when I got serious about going to this high school, I mean, I was like home practicing every day, you know. And if I was skipping Lamar High School, I was home practicing and getting ready for my audition. And I had a lot of catching up to do because a lot of these students at this school, they had gone to, I think it was Johnson Middle School in Houston, where it was kind of a similar program, but for middle schoolers. So a lot of these guys had been involved and a lot of in the jazz community, in the young jazz community in Houston for years. So I had a lot of catching up to do. So I think when they saw me take it so seriously, they let me just go for it.
So how did you pick up the bass? I mean, how did you literally start playing bass at that stage? How did you come to it?
Well, I borrowed a bass from a friend. It was a fretless acoustic electric Guild. I borrowed it from him for like a few months. And I just practiced my ass off, you know. And I took what I knew about the guitar and kind of applied it to the bass.
When you got to the high school, what was the scene like? I guess I should have asked you about the audition. Do you have any memory of that audition?
I do. The director at the time was Dr. Robert Morgan. We all called him Doc, and he was known around the city as Doc. He had quite a reputation, and a great reputation. I mean, he was a really awesome educator. And I was terrified going in because I'd seen him. I'd gone to see the HSPVA, spaghetti suppers and concerts that they'd put on and stuff. And you'd just go and check it out. And I'd seen him, and he was a serious character, and I was really intimidated. And I went in there just feeling like I really wasn't worthy. I was really scared. And I think in hindsight, I had actually worked out a solo. I think the song I picked to audition on was called "Tune Up," a Miles Davis song, and I had prepared like maybe 2 or 3 solos so that if he asked me to do it again, I could play my second solo and make it look like I was improvising. And I was really intimidated, and I really thought I bombed. And I left, and then, later I was accepted, and I was thrilled. But that's the thing I remember was really preparing the solos and wondering if I was going to get busted for that. At the time, I was really aware of Mike Moreno. I'd seen him play a lot. Robert Glasper, Walter Smith, Kendrick Scott. These are the guys that were like I went into that school my junior year of high school, so they had just graduated 1 or 2 years before I got in. Those guys had all left, and when I got in, Josh Meese was still there, who became one of my absolute closest friends, as you know. Yeah. And we're still super tight. And Delton Lee is a drummer that lives in Houston still. And his younger brother, Brandon Lee, a trumpet player who's here in New York, I believe. Mm-hmm. And Jamire Williams was there, Reggie Quinterly.
What was the racial dynamic of growing up in Houston before you got to that high school like?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that Houston is a very diverse city. It's a very international city, but I think it's spread out. I mean, neighborhoods kind of tend to be more white or more Hispanic or more black. I think that that's fair to say. I certainly was hanging out with most mixed company after I got into that school. Absolutely. And I just watched the Muscle Shoals documentary.
So great.
So great, man. I think it was, like 2 nights ago I just watched this, and they were talking so much about, the studio in Alabama and all this, all the racism going on at the time and in the area. And I was really sort of relating to how they were sort of talking about how beautiful it was that they're like, we went into this studio and we dealt with the task at hand. I mean, we had this thing that we were in love with. We were dealing with this music that we loved. And we could just bypass all of that crap, that was going on outside, outside the door. I could really relate to that.
Yeah, there was something else that was so powerful for me about that movie that actually does tie in a little bit with your experience. It's a little bit different, but it's that the idea that so much music was made by so few people, and that there was a kind of a shorthand between those people. They knew each other so well that they could cross genre. They had such a strong conception playing together that they could play soul music or southern rock music. Didn't really matter. It was those same guys.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's jumping ahead a little bit, but I know that you have, and you mentioned quite a few names that you still are very much in touch with now in New York, and your life has taken this long kind of trajectory to get here, but Glasper and Meese and there's some people that you came up with that are still very much in your world today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In some ways it kind of explains to me why you're able to blend genre in a way that seems like totally unexpected to me. I see video of you, for example, playing acoustic guitar in Glasper's band sometimes, and it's like, God, I would not expect that. I would not see that coming.
I mean, I've thought about that too. It just becomes kind of genreless, and everybody just wants to play with each other, man, and wants to just dig what the other people are doing, and it's a beautiful thing.
what was the feeling like at that school? Was it a jazz-centric program? Were you kind of searching? What was your second 2 years of high school like?
It was really, in a positive way, it was very competitive. I mean, it wasn't an ugly scene at all. And when I say competitive, let me kind of give a better idea what it was like. I mean, basically, the bell rang at, say, 3:30 or 4, whenever school was over. Everybody stayed until 8 o'clock at night, if they could. People stayed and they jammed, and people would take different rooms, and they'd be out in the cafeteria where we would have lunch, and people would set up out there and play. And I mean, people were constantly playing music. At lunch, you'd go in there, and the piano player in combo would be working on drums and stuff like that. Everybody was writing all the time. There were pianos everywhere. It just made you feel like you could be rewarded for working hard. It made me feel that way. Yeah, I guess, after going to Lamar, where it was like the star on the lacrosse team was the dude that would walk around like a god, through the lunch lines. At HSPVA, you could kind of, suddenly the jazz geeks, like we had our shot, walking around and feeling like, all right, man, it's cool to be good at something,
After high school, then, where did you go?
I went to the New School, and it was a toss-up for me between Berkeley and the New School. I think that I had a lot of friends that were going to the New School at the time, and that's really what kind of tipped the scale.
When you moved here, did you see yourself primarily as an upright bass player? Was that your main focus?
Yeah, I think it was. It was at the time. And I knew that I was coming from a lot of other influences. And I knew this the whole time I was at HSPVA, too, I think, those last 2 years of high school, and I really immersed myself in just jazz. And I knew that those were still there, but I was definitely just going after working on being a bass player, and it was pretty much all upright at the time, pretty much all jazz.
Were you writing songs on the side?
I was.
What'd you do with them? Like, what did you do with them emotionally or psychologically or physically? I mean, did you play them?
I never in public, no. I played them sometimes with Josh. He was doing kind of the same. We were like closeted songwriters, And he was a big influence on me because he really was getting into it on a serious level before I did, and I was kind of watching him do that, and I was so inspired, by him. And he had this sort of, it's like he would just kind of disappear into his room. We shared an apartment in Carroll Gardens, and he'd go into his room and just like be gone for 8 hours and come out with this really silly recording of some song that was like, fart sounds or whatever. I mean, it would be something absurd, but he will have figured out this little, recording mechanism, this little gizmo. And then, later on he'd start writing some more of those silly songs, but there would be these incredible little musical moments in them. And those it seemed like he kind of followed that and just got into being a really heavy, heavy songwriter. And I was just constantly blown away by the stuff he was making. And I would kind of try my hand at it and be like, yeah, okay, that was all right. But, I didn't think they were good enough to be playing in public. But I loved writing them, so I did. Yeah. And I definitely was writing a lot of jazz tunes as well.
Instrumental jazz tunes?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I feel like writing music has been a part of it. Since the second I thought I could write music, I wanted to do that.
What was your scene like at the New School, your jazz scene like? What was the music that you found here in the contemporary jazz world, or in the jazz world?
Well, my freshman year at the New School was Robert Glasper's senior year. And he really got me onto a lot of sessions and onto a lot of gigs.
Had you stayed in touch with him when he moved, after he moved here?
Yep. He would come back to Houston after he had already moved to New York, like say my senior years of PVA. The guys from New York, Mike Moreno, Robert, Walter, Kendrick, they'd all come back from New York and Boston, wherever they were, and they'd book a gig at like Cezanne's, which was the club in Houston that everybody would play. And say if like Mark Kelly wasn't in town, sometimes I'd get the call, and so I'd get to play with these guys, and it was a huge deal for me, man. I was pissing my pants every time.
You're a senior in high school playing with these guys.
Yeah, and it was great, man. It was great. I mean, they really schooled me and helped me get my stuff together, and so yeah, I'd kept in touch with Robert, absolutely, and he really was one of the most inviting dudes for me when I got to New York. He was a guy that was like, he linked me up with Keon Harold, and I would be playing with Robert and Damian Reed and all these people. It was great, man.
At that stage, were you having conversations about where, let's say, hip-hop and jazz would meet in the music? Was that something that you talked about?
I don't remember it being something that was talked about so much. I remember being on gigs and then, Robert really going into something. He's so fluid with it, and always has been. And he's always been that kind of musician. I mean, in high school, an idea could pop into his head, whether it's funny or like, somber, whatever it is, and he could just go there like with really non sequitur. It could just be such a smooth transition. I didn't know a ton about hip hop, so, and still don't. But,
yeah.
But I just play music with people that do, and so that's my experience with it.
So Glasper was one of your first contacts when you came here, and
Yeah.
he brought you around.
Yeah.
So even while you were in school, you were kind of able to connect on a scene outside of the new school scene.
And it was all based on those high school relationships, man. It was all based on that HSPVA community.
When you finished college, then what? What did you think after you finished college?
Well, I left the new school to go to the Thelonious Monk Institute in L.A. That's a jazz program. But when I got to Los Angeles, there were all these rock bands that were doing these kind of TV shows things, and I was getting called to do some of that.
Like what?
My friend Zach Hexum is an awesome saxophone player that I met in New York. Actually, we met playing basketball like somewhere, very randomly, and we got to talking. He was a sax player. We knew a lot of the same people, Bill Campbell and a bunch of other friends, musicians. And we started playing together. We played together maybe once or twice in New York. He moved to L.A. I moved there afterwards to go to the Monk Institute, and we got in touch with each other. And he was writing songs and making a go for it as a songwriter. And so I was playing with him, and he had some great gigs. His older brother is Nick Hexum of 311, and so we did a lot of gigs opening for him. And so I remember we played in like a stadium in Phoenix and stuff. And so for me at that time, that was the biggest thing I'd ever done, and still probably is, the biggest audience. And those experiences were really exciting for me, and that kind of got me thinking on a professional level about the songs that I'd been writing all along.
The power of a song.
Yeah. And also the main influence for me, or the main focus in the Monk Institute, Terrence Blanchard was the artistic director while I was there, and his thing was like, write music, write. And I loved that. He had all kinds of great wisdoms to bestow onto us, and all kinds of techniques he taught us, about writing. And I'd never had instruction in writing before. I'd just kind of done it. So I was just getting into that and writing anything that came to me. And then, being influenced by working with songwriters, and then being influenced by listening to Terrence's film scores. And of course, we were studying all this Wayne and having to play Wayne shorter tunes with him, which was like, and with Herbie Hancock.
Yeah, what was
that
like?
Mind-blowing. Songs that sounded so that like they could move you so immediately. It wasn't like I had to think about these songs to realize why they were great. Like Nefertiti, for example. But then you look at it on an analytical level, and you just like, wow, this is, I don't know, what's that, 10 bars, 12 bars of written music, and it's dynamite. I mean, It's like just the way that little theme moves is so haunting and so strong. And then to play those songs with them, Wayne could play Nefertiti and Herbie too. These guys would play this song, and they're developing these ideas like on such a high level and so naturally. I could not hang.
Huh.
Needless to say.
Did you feel like you felt like you couldn't hang?
Yeah, man.
It must be interesting too to watch somebody working out these creative ideas on a piece of music that they've been intimately familiar with for 30 or 40 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, for Wayne to be working out new ideas on a tune that he wrote in the late 60s, this is like a child that, he's been with the whole time.
True.
And yet there's still this endless possibility of new ideas. That seems very inspiring to me and very powerful.
Yeah.
Especially when you think, yes, 12 bars.
Yeah, and he can wring out that much from it forever. I mean,
Yeah. Did they say anything to you? Did they talk to you about your playing? Did they encourage or...
There weren't a lot of it wasn't a lot of that. It was a lot of like let's see, we did this the first time I played with Wayne. First time I performed with Wayne, because we'd met him a couple times in the Institute. We were going to play in Paris in this big theater, and Herbie was playing and Wayne was playing, and then our band, the Monk Institute, think it was like 5 of us, maybe 6 of us. I was so nervous, man. I was so terrified, but so excited. I couldn't wait. And this was just like blowing my mind. And I was, side stage waiting to go on. And it ends up, I just happened to be there with Wayne. Wayne's there putting his soprano saxophone together. And he's standing there. I didn't know what to say, but I knew I had to say something. And I was just like, oh, well, it's so great to get to work with you, Mr. Shorter. And he's, and he doesn't quite respond. And I was like, you're just one of my main influences. You've done so much for me music. And he's kind of sitting there and he's still kind of just putting his saxophone together. And I was like, that's a, it turns into like, man, that's a nice suit, Mr. Shorter. And it's getting a little weird, and then he had this watch. And it was this huge ceramic like dragon, or something like this on this watch. It was this giant thing. And I remember being like, "That's a really cool watch, Mr. Shorter." And he looks at me and he's like, "Hey man, you know what?" I was like, "What?" And he's like, "Woo!" And that's it. And then he walks off. and it cut me deeply, but I learned a whole lot.
Well, what do you think he meant by it?
I think he was just like, "Hey, it's all good, it's all good. Relax." I think that's all it was. And it was loving. He had a look in his eye. I don't think he was trying to be a jerk at all. He was just like, "Hey, it's cool." But it was a lot of interactions like that. I mean, I was just so starry-eyed,
Yeah,
with those guys. Obviously,
what a wonderful way to sort of like enter. It's nice when when you get a nice entrance into your professional life. And it's like positive and. Little do you know what awaits you on the other side of it.
Yeah, little do you know indeed.
So what happened? You moved back to New York after L.A., or did you stay out there for a little while?
No, I moved back to New York. I was anxious to get back to New York the whole time I was in the Institute. I think I loved being in L.A. It was very comfortable, but I felt like there was so much energy in New York, and I really missed going and seeing music all the time. When I was in L.A., every Friday, John Bryan had this show at Largo. And I was in that line, man. Every Friday that I could be there, I was there. I waited in that line that was around the block, and I went in and watched that show. Other than that, there wasn't a whole lot of music that I was getting to go see.
It's funny that you say that, man, because when I hear your solo records, there's something very West Coast about them, actually. There's something for me that feels very California about that music. I haven't been able to really articulate it before. But there is a kind of a John Bryan influence in the music, I think.
Sure. I was just so impressed by him. And like Robert Glasper, he was one of these musicians, one of these few musicians that you kind of see every now and again that just, you can tell they're just like, they have this music child in them that just needs to play all the time. And on the show, he would play like Duke Ellington, solo piano, Duke Ellington stuff. And just sound and play it beautifully, so convincingly. And then he'd play something that he'd written for a film score, and then he would go into playing some like British rock. And then he'd play Prince, and it all had this John Bryan thumbprint, but he could do anything he wanted, and it just seemed like he didn't care. And I think that was the thing, one of those things that I've always been really drawn to in musicians, and so. That was maybe one of the biggest things of him that influenced me, I think, is just me wanting to be that, wanting to have that ability.
And that freedom to not be worried about what box you put yourself in.
Yeah. Just this, like, he has this stage, and he has his instruments, and he's going to make it up on the spot. So there was that spontaneous element. He's going to do whatever he wants to do, and he's going to bring you into his world, and you just get to kind of go there for a little while. Not like he was trying to cater to some sort of, some outside principles being imposed upon him.
That's a huge distinction that I think about a lot, and I've talked to a number of performers about that distinction between reaching out to an audience and asking an audience to be drawn into you. I am also very drawn to the kinds of artists that kind of create a space, and they're going to be in that space whether or not you go with them.
Yeah.
And they sort of invite you or challenge you or basically set up a set of conditions where you can choose to enter into that universe if you want to.
It's where our human personalities really kind of come out in our art form, right? I mean, the extroverts and the introverts, Southern hospitality, Do
you think your personality comes out in your playing?
God, I hope so. If I'm being honest, then I think that that yes, it comes out in my playing. Recently, someone said something to me. They made an observation about my playing that I was so grateful for. It was Michelle and Degio cello. We were playing in a band with two drummers, and she and I were both in the band, so we were kind of alternating roles. I'd play some bass, she'd play some bass, which, by the way, is terrifying. Those are tough.
What do you play? What do you play when you're not playing bass?
Get a lot of guitar. We've been writing for a band that I'll tell you more about. It's been great, but it's with Levon Henry and Michelle and Degio cello and myself. It's another story, and it's new and really exciting for me. But we did some playing recently, and we were talking about it afterwards. And she's like, "Yeah, I was listening to you play, and I think that you really want the drummer to play to you. You kind of put it down and want a drummer to come to you." And she's like, "I think I like to play to a drummer. I tend to listen to the drummer and I play to them." And I think she wasn't saying one was absolutely better or worse than the other. It was just like, "Oh, check out these differences," And I was like, "Wow, I never knew that about myself, but I think that you're right."
You relate to that when she said it?
Yeah, I think that's, and I definitely trust her observation. I mean, she's checking stuff out and she's really paying attention. And
I'm such a fan of hers as well. I remember when you started to play a little bit with her, and I thought at the time exactly what you just said, which is there must be an element of just totally being terrified playing bass for somebody who's such a strong bass player and such a stylist as a bass player.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what I mean by terrifying. It's an absolute privilege and a joy. She's awesome in so many ways. And we did a gig recently where we both played into like an AB box and went into the same amplifier. And she had an amp and she had a bass and I had a bass, and we matched our sounds and our levels because we had different instruments, and so we EQ'd them to get the same sound out of the amplifier, so that the idea was that she could start playing bass in a song, and then I'd pick up the bass and pick up whatever the line she was playing, and then she would sing, and then maybe do some different things, and relieve her of bass duty, and that was it's so cool and so fun and so humbling, I'm just sitting there, I start playing, I'm looking at the band like, sorry guys.
I'm sure it's killing, but I do wonder if, not better or worse, but if you feel a shift in the band, even if it's a subtle shift when one bass player exits and another enters. Do you feel the drummer adjust to it, or the rest of the band adjust?
Yeah, I think so. It definitely takes me a sec. It's like I'm a car and my wheels are already spinning. I'm up off the ground and then I gotta hit the ground, so the wheels kind of skid for a second, before you get any traction and kind of get on the road again. I think there's definitely a little hiccup, and everybody kind of goes, "Oh," and then it kind of
goes
finds
forward.
Its groove. But yeah, sure, I think so.
It doesn't surprise me, when you say that you are developing a repertoire for a band with Michelle and Degio cello, in the same way that ultimately with almost everybody that you have been able to work with over a long period of time, you end up becoming a kind of a member of the band. With Gretchen, certainly live, you started singing and writing, and it wasn't just the sort of a lot of times the usual delineation between front person and side person. You tend to kind of find a way, because of who you are and that sensitivity, to find your way into really inside the music and start writing towards that music.
Well, I think that the writing is the thing that maybe allows me to sometimes get involved in different roles in a band. If I'm invited to write, I always really appreciate that. And that just gives you a different opportunity to sort of kind of say, okay, well, let's try this, Let's try it this way. Let's have two voices or something. And I hope it's not, I don't mean to bogart.
Right. I'm
not trying to get myself a promotion necessarily. But.
How did you start working with Gretchen Parlato, and what was the experience of that project?
We met in the revolving door of the Monk Institute. Her band was leaving in 2003, right as my band was joining. I think we moved to Los Angeles the same week they were moving out or something like that. And so I saw her around, and we were all shaking hands. I mean, the Institute they want the bands to kind of commingle a little bit. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of opportunity for that to happen. So that's how I met her. And when my class was finished in 2005, I moved back to New York, and she was one of the first people I started working with. We just started working together right away. I don't remember how exactly it happened. I think she had a gig and called me for it, and I did it. and we really got along and got to be really good friends right off the bat, and we definitely bonded on the songwriting thing pretty quickly. I think we liked a lot of the same music.
Like what?
We had the Beatles in common, had Stevie Wonder in common, a lot of classics, you know. And I think that we just sort of, I loved her sensibility as a singer. I was always really, really attracted to her music, man, and her voice. I think she's got something so great and so understated and just so natural and great. So, you know, hanging out, we'd listen to songs, and I think, and also she took an interest in the fact that she found out that Josh and I were writing songs, and she took an interest in it, and she was really encouraging and really like, hey, play me more songs, and we would hang out and just play songs together a lot, you know. She was one of the people that kind of gave me a lot of the confidence to try to make a record of my own songs, and to kind of take on really playing them. So we had a lot in common.
That seems like another one of those projects that dances in and out of category. You know, I mean, it's very much perceived to be within the world of jazz. It's a jazz project. She's a jazz singer. You play jazz venues. You go out, you know, she'll often tour with a quartet. It feels like a jazz project. Although when you listen to it, it's not so cut and dry. Sometimes material isn't. I mean, there's a lot of improvising, but it also crosses over into this other terrain. I'm not even sure what to call it. Again, I have a feeling I know the answer, but was that something that was explicit, that was talked about? Like, we're going to open this up, we're going to change what the expectation is?
I certainly wasn't involved in any conversations like that with her. I think that she just was really interested in certain sounds, and she's a really gifted collaborator. She's really good at she's a very sympathetic person, and I think when she starts working with someone, she's excellent at creating space for somebody to really contribute, you know? And she's so great at embracing whatever they're contributing and making that kind of happen and really letting that thing develop. So she's collaborated with a lot of musicians, and so it's no wonder that when she gets a group of different musicians that have a similarity in common, that it becomes this very eclectic thing. I mean, she really lets everybody's voice kind of ring through. Yeah. I wonder what the conversations were like in terms of marketing or in terms of figuring out how to tour that type of thing. I mean, because I think that some of her songs, you could have taken those songs exactly as they are. You could have taken Gretchen into a studio and produced those a certain way, and had them sound like you could treat them like a top 40 type of thing, you know, and have them be produced that way. Or you could just change the band and change the instrumentation and have it be exactly what it is now, and have it work in a jazz context, you know, which is the case in a lot of great music, you know. Totally,
and I think that really speaks to the heart of what I imagine is your challenge as an artist, which is that you have so much fluidity, and yet when you make your own record, it, unlike Glasper or Gretchen or Becca Stevens even, for whatever reason, your record is harder to pin down and harder to place maybe in a jazz context. I mean, you walked in today talking about this before we started the conversation, that you know, you decided that even as a solo artist, you're ready to embrace your jazz community and kind of define yourself in those terms now. Yeah. It's a challenge. I think that that is your community, and yet the music certainly has the ability to cross over outside of that. It doesn't have a lot of blowing on it. It doesn't have a lot of the kind of markers of jazz, in quotes. But that is a lot of your world and your aesthetic universe comes from the jazz side. Yeah, you know, it's kind of like we talked about earlier. You just kind of make the music you're going to make, and you make it the way you're hearing it, and then you can kind of package it, I guess, and direct it from a marketing standpoint, whatever direction you think it's going to succeed the most in. I don't know. Well, let me say this. I think, go back to, say, when I was in the new school, when I was just doing jazz, I had a lot of gripes about certain things in the jazz community. There was a lot of sort of macho competition going on, and sort of, at times, if the jazz community could feel very like athletic and competitive, and it just it wasn't speaking to me on an emotional level.
a lot of the time. And I sort of built up this fantasy in my head about these songwriters and about these rock bands. Oh man, they're cool. They didn't fill their head with all this music theory. They just rock, man. And so I started playing with some rock bands, and then you go to those rock bands and they're super into authenticity of rock, and they're super into who plays what, and there's just as much of a hierarchy, as I was finding in the jazz community. And then I was like, well, man, let me get into some other stuff. Let me get into some of these, some classical music, and then have a similar experience. And I come to find that all of the things that I would sort of condemn about one genre, they all existed in every single other genre. It's the exact same stuff, kind of like the music. The music is the same thing. I'd be like, jazz just isn't what it was back in the 50s, man. And it's like, well, neither is rock, and neither is anything, but it is what it is now, and you got to kind of take it on its terms and move on and kind of break down these sort of compartmentalized fantasies about these genres or these pockets that are happening. If you can identify it, it's probably gone. It's probably over. There's something happening now that let's try to be a part of.
Once you name it, it's sort of over.
Yeah.
You kill it when you name it.
Yeah. So I don't know if we need blowing on jazz records right now, or if we're going to put jazz in the genre box for it to go in the jazz category in iTunes. I don't know if it needs to have solos. I don't know if it needs to have all be recorded live. I don't know. But I did a gig recently where I had a fantastic piano player. I played a duet concert in Lithuania, and we were playing my music, and a great piano player named Tom Cawley played, and we played the songs like they were, we opened them up like they were jazz tunes, and I wrote in little sections for him to sort of open up. And if he wasn't soloing, at least we were just playing instrumentally, and we gave ourselves room to sort of improvise and let a tune grow or shrink or whatever. That's cool. I didn't feel like I was committing a crime to any of the rockers out there, man, or anybody else. So
you played with Gretchen for a long time, and then you started working with Andrew Bird.
Yes.
How did you meet Bird, and how did that begin?
I became a fan of Andrew Bird through a friend years before I met him. And when I was working on my first record, The Moving Sidewalk, I was talking to Pete Rendy, the guy, Pete who engineered it and co-produced it and really helped me make that record. We were talking about what kind of sounds we wanted to go after. And, he wanted me to bring him some records that I really liked the sound of. And I looked for some stuff that had happened, some old records that I really dug. And I wanted to make sure I was listening to some new stuff, some current stuff that I also really appreciated.
What were some of the older things?
God, I was probably all over the place. I'm sure I brought him some. I'm sure that I brought up Pet Sounds. Probably some old Bob Marley stuff, which was just like, I don't know how I was planning on integrating that into that record. I was all over the place, man. Sam Cooke. We were trying to pick sort of a sound, and we were looking for aesthetics that I felt like I could relate to. We were also trying to pick how we were going to mix the record, and I loved the way that Andrew Bird's records sounded and the way they were mixed. They weren't so like beating you over the head with like hit power, and they weren't just trying to. They felt really cool and really like they knew themselves, and very different, kind of like what you've been talking about. I think he's an extremely original artist, and he really trusts his process, and he knows when something's talking to him. So I think he has very, very original music, and he's excellent at performing it. So he was a guy I thought about. And I did some research to try to figure out who engineered and who mixed those records. And I found the name David Boucher. And at the time, coincidentally, my friend Christina Corton was just out in L.A. working with David Boucher on a record. And I found that out, and I was like, oh, you know this guy David Boucher? I've been looking for him, and blah, blah, blah. Or I've just been checking out his work.
Yeah, that's the record that John Bryan was involved with in some way?
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's a great, great record. And David Boucher, I believe he engineered it and mixed it. She and Ryan Scott, who both worked on that record, they put me in touch with David Boucher. And I sent him some music, and he was like, okay, cool. And he was interested. And I loved it, too, because he was out in L.A., and I had no idea anything about this world, anything about this person or his network, really. I knew these records, these like Andrew Bird kind of indie rock records that I knew nothing about. Again, indie rock maybe in the in the genre category of
Right.
iTunes. I don't know if I would call it that, but so I loved having this sort of anonymous character that I was a fan of out in the West Coast that I'd never met or seen. And he was mixing the record. He was sending me back these mixes that I was blown away by. You know,
Yeah. I
had never experienced that shift from your raw tracks into the mixed world. And I was like, oh my God, wow. So I got to know David through working on this record with him. And eventually, Bird was in New York, and he was doing some recording, and he needed to borrow. He was looking for a hollow body bass to play on his record, and not a bassist, but an instrument.
Just the bass.
And Boucher said, "Hey, I know somebody that has a good bass you could borrow," and he put us in touch. And so I brought Bird a bass and went to the studio, and we kind of talked and hung out for a second and got along great. And I let him know that I really loved his music and knew it and knew a lot of it, you know. And I was making it a point at the time to, if I liked someone's music, I was trying to learn it on the bass. I wanted to just learn the music. Number one, I got to study their writing. Number two, just in case a call came through, I was prepared.
Was that was part of the thinking?
That was definitely part of the thinking. It was a very deliberate thing. I made a list of musicians before I moved back from LA to New York of people I wanted to work with. And I went through and I bought their records and I learned their repertoire.
Who was on the list?
John Ellis, I think he's maybe the only other guy that worked with. But I contacted him before I came out to New York, and I said, "Hey man, I named 3 records. I think he maybe had 3 records at the time." And I said, I had learned them because I loved them, so it was fun to learn them.
Sure.
And I said, "I know your music. If you need someone to sub a rehearsal or whatever, I'm just getting to New York. I'm trying to meet people." So yeah, so John was on that list, and he took me up on it, and I ended up touring with him and playing with him a lot, which was really great.
So who else was on the list that didn't pan out? At least not yet.
John Schofield. A guy named Luke Temple was on that list, and I ended up playing with him recently. We haven't done a lot of work together, but I got to do a good bit of work with him, which I was thrilled by. I'm a huge fan of his. Let's see. That list was long. I think Kenny Barron was on the list, and for him it was mostly standards and stuff. The repertoire wasn't as much learning originals, although he's written a lot of stuff, a lot of great tunes. Yeah, it was kind of all over the place. I think I had probably 15, 20 names on it.
Yeah, right there, that list going from Kenny Barron, John Schofield, John Ellis, and Andrew Bird.
Yeah,
is a pretty diverse cross section of the music. I mean, it actually is very much what your career is like.
Yeah, it felt like an identity crisis, I think, when I was in LA looking at that list. I think I felt like I wanted to never play jazz again before I went to the Monk Institute. I think I was so burnt out on it. I wanted to run away from it. I just got tired. I think that I came from other genres, and I wasn't really getting opportunities to play them as much. In jazz, I developed an association with playing jazz with music education, which meant everything I played afterwards, I was going to have someone be like, okay, that was cool, but now I want you to think about blah, blah, blah. Or, okay, I'm not impressed. Yeah, you did this. I had this thing where it was like I constantly felt like I was having to prove myself with jazz, which has been is still with me today, I feel like only in the last couple of years I've gotten over this sort of burning sensation I used to get when I had to take a bass solo somewhere after 50 other soloists have just been lighting up the room with their impressive gymnastics. It was like, bass solo, okay, juggling clown, do something impressive, and I would be filled with hatred for an audience, and for the other people, and just for the genre. I was like, God, I hate this. I hate these bass solos and this sort of, okay, do something really impressive right now. I hated that. I've come to terms with it, Mm-hmm. I don't feel now like I have to impress someone. That's not my mentality when I play jazz. But I developed that for a little while. And that made me want to run back to my roots in rock and roll and songwriting and things like that. And that frightened me for a long time when I was scared I couldn't make a living as a songwriter because I had jazz gigs. I didn't have enough songwriting or rock and roll gigs to make a living, so it felt like an identity crisis.
So you contacted Bird when you met Bird, you let him know that you knew his tunes.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah, it worked, I think by the time that I met Bird, I had kind of gone through that list and maybe done it in a groping way a couple of times. It'd been a little like, hey man, let me play with you. So by the time I met Bird, I maybe calmed down a little bit and found a more gentle way of saying, hey man, I'd be happy to play with you if you ever need anything, whatever. And so he took me up on it eventually, I stayed in touch, and he eventually needed a bass player, and I was around, and I knew the book, and I was ready to go. So we started playing together, and I felt a real likeness with Bird. I felt like we had a lot in common. So that's been a great musical relationship. I've learned a lot from him. He's one of these artists that does what he wants to do. He does what he knows he wants to do artistically. He follows that, and he doesn't tend to cater too much to sort of, genre dogma.
Did it have an influence on your music?
It has. It has had an influence on my music. Yeah, he's really put my ass over the fire in terms of lyrics. I feel like, wow, okay. I mean, he's raised the bar.
Have you talked about lyric writing with him at all?
Yeah, just a lot of talking to him about what certain songs of his are about.
I find you to be such an emotional writer. I find there to be so much emotion in the sound of your songs. But I know that underneath it, there's also this like depth and a certain amount of pain I feel sometimes in your songs. I don't know if that's fair to say or not, but I feel like you're like a totally happy-go-lucky guy in real life, and then there's like this curtain that gets pulled back when you start to write. Do you feel that?
I do. I've been self-conscious about it at times, and I've thought about it in sort of the pre-production of records. Like, okay, do I want to have this much content? Do I want to feel like I'm sort of, is this too much? Is this overwhelming?
Sharing too much, revealing too much?
Yeah, a little bit. Like, I don't know. I've just wondered sometimes.
It's funny, like you talk about almost your body seizing up before you have to take a bass solo for a long time. But it doesn't seem like your body seizes up when it's time to write a hard lyric.
That's a very interesting observation. Yeah, I think that's true. I grew up with my mother playing piano, and she's a very happy person, but she's had a lot of pain in her life, and so she sort of, growing up, she really dealt with that playing the piano, from what I could tell, also from community and her friends and stuff like this. But she really was very willing to sit down at the piano and just kind of let her rip. And my brothers and I, we saw that, all the time, every night, man. There are periods where she would just play all the time, and it was like she was working something out. I don't know. I wonder if I think lately I'm going to that.
Yeah, that's like really where your music and your life meet.
It's got to serve a purpose, I think. That's what keeps us coming back. And in terms of the lyric writing, sometimes I think I've wanted to obscure things to maybe not make it so confessional. And sometimes it's not actually a conscious decision. Sometimes it's just, I'm not exactly sure what it is that what it is maybe emotionally that I'm feeling right now, but it's here, and some lyric kind of accesses something, and I think that I usually will call a song done when at some point in the writing process, somewhere along the way, I hope that I've felt like eureka, like, oh, that hit something, like I get a little tingling sensation. I'm not always sure what it is, but that makes me feel like that just validated this song, and makes me feel like it's.
Do those moments come spontaneously, like they just pass through you, or are you sitting with a pencil at the paper struggling or at least working to find out what it is?
I tend to work on a song for a bit. It takes pen and paper. It takes kind of looking at it and turning it upside down and stuff for me. That's the only way I've been able to sort of approach even being prolific. That's the only way to... they say inspiration is for amateurs. For me, I believe that I'm having to really work to try to squeeze out the ideas.
It's funny. I haven't heard inspiration is for amateurs, but it is true. I think about this a lot when it comes to writing for commercials. For example, I write a lot for commercials, and a lot of times that's just like, we need this tomorrow at 3 p.m. Yeah. So whatever you write by 3 p.m., it's finished. Yeah. And then when it comes time to like write a song for myself, of course, there's nobody setting that deadline except possibly me. Of course, I'm ready to negotiate with myself at all times to extend that deadline for myself. Yeah. And so I take a lot longer, and I think probably do wait for the inspiration in a slightly more mysterious way, even though I know that if I had to write it right now, I would write it. We all can do it at any time. Mm-hmm. And given permission to stretch it out, we're going to stretch it out.
Songs can become precious in the writing process, right? You can feel like, oh, this is cool. You have a moment of inspiration, and it can be so fleeting. But then how do you finish it, you know? Now that inspiration that started this song happened, but now it's gone, and you still got to finish the thing, you know? So, I don't know. I think you have to learn to sort of turn a song upside down and look at it and complete it and see it through.
When you eventually started touring with Bird, it was a little bit of a shift for you because you were still kind of on the road with Gretchen, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Were you worried about making that shift? I mean, not for any number of reasons, but one thing I can imagine that it took you out of one universe and placed you squarely in another universe, at least from the perception of the jazz world, you were kind of exiting.
Yeah, I was really excited to see what Bird's world was like, you know. I was really curious, and I was so excited because a lot of the festivals and a lot of the shows we were doing, yeah, there was a lot of festivals where I was getting to see so many bands that I was so curious of what their process was like. And I wanted to see this other world, you know. And it was interesting. It's not the same as the jazz world. In a lot of ways it is. It's just music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, in like the cafeteria line behind the festival, or the catering tent or whatever, you know, the hang is, I knew everybody in the jazz,
yeah.
the jazz catering line. In the rock world, it wasn't quite like that for me. And it was different. It was a little more standoffish, you know.
What do you mean?
I don't know. I mean, maybe if you're in it for a long time, you get to know everybody. But a lot of these bands, in my experience, I think that you're a band, you got together as a band, they're not exchanging members all the time. It's not like, so-and-so sounded good playing with this guy, so let's have him in our band, see what happens. Let's mix up the chemistry the same way it happens in jazz. For better or for worse. So there's just not as much cross-pollination all the time.
Yeah.
You're not sharing all the time the same way.
I am always curious about even the concept of a band. They seem like these closed entities, right? They're these closed systems. A band is the sound of the Rolling Stones is the sound of those people playing that music.
Yeah.
And even Radiohead is the sound of Radiohead. And I think this is what a band sounds like. It's about the imperfections and the personalities of these four people.
Yes.
Whereas in the jazz world, there's all of this movement, and you look at each kind of person as their own individual thing, and then you check out the way they interact with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very attractive to me. I like to play different kinds of music, and I want to play with everybody, so I've been attracted to trying to sort of take the artist route, like you're talking about, rather than the band thing. But also, sometimes I really long for a band, a community, you know. So it's not you just pulling all the weight for yourself to try to be this artist. I mean, that'd be great to develop a shorthand with your other guys, and you know, with the other people in the band. That's a beautiful thing when a group of people come together and they're, what do they say? They're greater than the sum of their parts. Mm-hmm. They become something bigger than just adding those four guys up. It takes on a whole new life. That's a beautiful thing.
So you got into the rock world a little bit. I mean, it's funny. I guess it was a rock world, right?
Well, there were certainly tons of rock bands. Yeah, you could say it was a rock world. And the shows were packed, man, and people love watching him, and I had so much fun being on the stage side, because I would have bought a ticket to a Bird show any day. In fact, I tried all the time. I had never seen his live show before I met him, but not for lack of trying. It had just never panned out. But to watch his show from the stage was really fun for me. You know, I was watching from the stage, looking at the audience, like. You know, one thing is, you know, how whistling is very infectious. I feel like it's like a yawn. One person hears someone whistling and they start whistling and they don't know why. So you'd look out in the audience and Bird would be whistling and you'd see all these people start whistling.
Did you get the perception that you were the sort of extra muso band among rock bands? Like, was there sort of like, oh, you guys are kind of a little bit classical and a little bit jazzy or a little more virtuosic than the other bands, or not necessarily?
You know, from my perspective, you'd go to a lot of these festivals, man, and I'm sure in the history of music, it's always been this way, and it's this way now, that there's a small percentage of whatever's going on that's actually great, right? Because that's what makes it great, is because it's so rare. So In a lot of these festivals, I really felt like I'd walk around, listen to band after band after band, and there were so few people that just had a song that they could just play you that was spectacular. I mean, extremely rare. They had a lot of cool tricks to make you pay attention, and they looked great, man. And boy, the energy was they were so energetic, but it was so much aesthetic and so little actual content in a lot of these places. And for me, man, Bird has it all. Like, the songs are incredible, the lyrics are incredible. There's so much thought in the way that they're constructed. The same songs would never be written from another artist. You know, they're unique. They're absolutely original from him. He'd go out there and he's playing this violin in this very beautiful way where I didn't even think about it like he was classical or jazz or indie rock, or I didn't care, but it was extremely captivating. And the way that he started his shows, I mean, you just watched the room. It was amazing.
Like John Bryan, right?
Yeah.
Inviting this collective of people to enter into his space.
Yeah.
Given that you saw a difference in the vibe between the rock world and the jazz world, it's interesting that at first you kind of tried to position yourself in that world.
Uh-huh.
Like you said, at the catering line at the jazz festival, you know everybody.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't know a whole lot about that, about the, let's call it the indie rock world, you know. The Coachella Festival, man. I didn't know what the inner workings were like, you know, and I was curious, and I thought it looked cool.
Yeah.
And the music I was writing and the music I was listening to fit into that world, and so I don't know, I just went for it, you know. And then the general masses, boy, I mean, you talk about jazz and you realize very, very quickly how it's like you're not having the same conversation. I mean, most people don't know a ton about jazz.
Certainly in the small world of jazz, things loom very large, and when you step to the side a little bit and look at it from another perspective, they don't even register.
Right.
It's a strange thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the other thing about jazz feels like a historical term sometimes. It seems like when you talk about jazz and whether or not it's still jazz, I don't know. We're talking about whether or not it's still that thing that happened in the 50s and 60s that was so beautiful and so incredible and so political, you know. It's a completely different climate right now, you know, and the conversation of whether or not this is jazz, it's just kind of, it seems off base to me at this point. I'm happy to be a part of the, quote, jazz community because I like a lot of the people. Mm-hmm. I like, you know, a good amount of the music that's being made or that's being put in the, quote, jazz festivals and things like that. And I feel like, you know, they like me back, man. You know, they've been nice to me. Jazz has been good to me. So I got no problem with it.
Alan Hampton, thank you so much, man. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah. Pleasure's all mine, man.